Great. So everybody should have a selected interpretation now, and just wanted to quickly introduce ourselves. Before we dive into today's presentation, I want to take some time to introduce to you the organization that's hosting this webinar today. As I mentioned, I'm Cynthia Pinto Cabrera with the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition. I serve as the policy coordinator for Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, or CVAC. And CVAC is your host tonight with support from the Wilderness Society. CVAC has been around for about 20 years, working as a broad and diverse coalition, unified in our advocacy effort to restore clean air to the San Joaquin Valley, where we envision a healthy and safe and economically prosperous San Joaquin Valley, where we're no longer suffering from sicknesses due to related air qualities. So that's a little bit about CVAC, your host tonight. Next up, wanted to just bring up some goals for today's workshop is to highlight natural and working lands and opportunities in the San Joaquin Valley and how these lands impact us as Valley residents. We also wanted to provide information for how community members can influence the scoping plan, also known as our climate plan for the state. And today's agenda, we will hear a little bit about a little bit from our Environmental Justice Advisory Committee group members who will talk a little bit about natural working lands and how it relates to the scoping plan. We'll hear from Honorable Chairman Ron Goode. We'll have some discussion after each presentation. We'll hear from Asha Sharma, the organizing co-director with Pesticide Action Network. Some more discussion lastly hear from Tori Estrada, the executive director and policy director for Carbon Cycle Institute, where we will finish off with plenty of time for some facilitated panel discussion and close off. So with that, I'll pass it off to Dr. Catherine Garupa-White and any other members joining us tonight to speak a little bit about natural working lands.
Thanks so much, Cynthia, and good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine Garupa-White, and I am the Executive Director of the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, or CVAC. I use they and she pronouns. As Cynthia mentioned, natural and working lands are important to the state of California for meeting our climate goals and significant for us as a region in the San Joaquin Valley. We are the most agriculturally productive region that has ever existed in human history. So we have a lot of working lands in the San Joaquin Valley, which you'll hear about tonight. Hopefully you've also had the opportunity to enjoy some of our beautiful iconic landscapes like Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon National Parks. I also teach geography classes, including California geography, and each time I teach the class, I'm always astounded by the diverse ecosystems. California is such a complex landscape, and it's been vastly altered by human beings, for better or for worse. While we want to acknowledge that we are on unceded Miwok and Yokich land, we also encourage you all to donate to and support Indigenous-led organizations and efforts, and ultimately to restore the land back to Indigenous peoples for traditional land management practices, which we'll also hear about tonight. I wanted to take just a minute to thank CVAC staff, particularly Cynthia for coordinating tonight, Jasmine for being on backup support, our expert panelists who I've learned so much from. And in case I didn't mention, I'm a member of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee and co-chair working on helping the state of California meet our climate goals. I want to thank and appreciate all of you for participating with us tonight, and thank our translators for making sure that we're making the meeting accessible in multiple languages. If there's one thing that I've learned through working on the scoping plan and getting to get a taste for the topic of natural and working lands, it's that there's still a lot unknown about how to appropriately model assumptions around natural and working lands. This is the first time the Air Resources Board has attempted such an effort. And certainly there's a lot of opportunity for growth and improvement. One of the commitments that the Air Resources Board has made is to convene an intra-agency work group, and there's also been related legislation passed. So we as CVAC and with our partner organizations across the region look forward to supporting these efforts to really leverage our natural and working lands to meet our climate goals. So before we hear from our panelists, I also wanted to acknowledge and thank my fellow EJAC members who've worked on developing a robust set of recommendations, including several on the line tonight, Tom Helm with Valley Improvement Projects and Matt Holmes with Little Manila Rising. I'm going to briefly pass it to Matt, a recovering park ranger who I'm proud to call a friend and tree hugger, to talk to us a bit more about what we've learned as the EJAC before we hear from our panelists. Matt, take it away.
Yeah, thanks. And really sorry, I don't have a camera to come online. I've got a sort of damaged computer, but my name is Matt Holmes. I'm the Environmental Justice Director at Little Manila Rising, based out of Stockton, California. My pronouns are he, him, his. And, you know, at Little Manila, we come to a lot of this environmental work from the humanities perspective. And we see a whole lot of the social sciences behind a lot of the inequality that comes out of this scenario planning that we get from our public agencies, who seem to assume that, you know, the world started yesterday and that ecological contingency hits everybody equally. And the natural and working land scenario really revealed the disparate outcomes for, you know, communities with histories of disinvestment. And so in a city like Stockton, where we were bankrupt when everybody was getting recycled wastewater, you know, purple pipe, our city has none of that. We've got millions of gallons sitting on the outside of town and no water to maintain the green infrastructure that keeps us alive. We also have a history of planned pollution and planned disease in our communities, so that when wildfires burn all over California and they hit Lake Tahoe and they hit Stockton, it hurts Stockton more, right? We're already a respiratory impacted population, suffering with it from advanced mortality rates. And so smoke doesn't hit everybody equally. I think big takeaways from this natural and working land scenario working group that we were on are that natural and working lands are very different. And modeling and describing those as if they are co-equivalents is really, you know, it's a mistake. It's a bad ontology. It's a bad way of knowing this opportunity. And I also think that we saw in both scenarios a lack of appreciation for the co-benefits that we can get as Californians by investing in, you know, more complete life cycle understanding of our natural and our working lands relationship. So jobs, income, resilience, you know, cash rules everything around us, and paying people to work on climate resilience projects and them having money in their bank account allows them to protect themselves during climate catastrophe and environmental contingency. And so getting CARB and our friends in state agencies across the board to acknowledge that people are a big part of calculations that seem to leave a lot of people out. There's a whole lot of counting tons per year of carbon in the sky, and there's a whole lot of you know, assuming that infrastructure works all the time, as if, you know, humans aren't involved at every step of the way. And so our ultimate recommendation to the CARB as a working group was that this was not a core competency of the Air Resources Board, and that there were multiple agencies and sub-agencies throughout California whose input was really left out of the scenario and failed to give us the robust scenario that we think we need, that gives us those human and co-benefits. And also reduce our warming gases. And so we weren't alone in thinking that, and there's certainly energy, and there's a bill actually to establish an interagency working group to help inform both the Natural Resources Agency's 30 by 30 plan and the Air Resources Board's economy-wide scoping plan. And so unfortunately, this, as Catherine said, this scenario was arrived at late, was integrated into the scoping plan, you know, in spirit, but not in data. And so we're still very much at a gestational stage with it. And there's a real opportunity for us to highlight, you know, the other resiliency issues besides total carbon in the atmosphere, the other co-benefits that can come from investing in our communities. And so I think that's sort of the backdrop of how we got here. And I hope we're sort of close to me passing this off to other panelists, unless there's something specific I've missed.
No, Matt, that's great. Thanks for sharing. informing folks on some of the work that's going on in natural working lands at the state level. So before I pass it off to this panelist, I just wanted to bring up a quick little poll for you all participating right now. And I'm about to launch it to try to get some initial thoughts and give our panelists an idea of how much before this panel, how aware you were of knowledge of climate issues related to natural and working land. So I'll go ahead and launch that poll, and you feel free to please answer, and I'll give you all a couple minutes. Great, we're about 51% participation. I think I'll give you all another minute. Great. We're about 72% participation. That's great. I think a few more folks just got to answer this question and we can get started. I can share the results. Right. Thanks everybody who participated in this poll. And let me see if I can share these results. Can you all see the results? We're looking at about 29% little to no knowledge on how climate issues are related to natural and working lands. Most of us have some knowledge. We're looking for more ways to get involved and to learn more about this topic. And only 2 of us consider ourselves experts. So that's definitely some context setting for our webinar tonight. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'll pass it off to our first panelist, who is the Honorable Chairman Ron Goode, who is the chairman for the North Fork Mono Tribe. And with that, go ahead, Chairman Goode.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me. Manahu to all my listeners out there, all those that are participating. That's actually a pretty big issue. It's one that's discussed somewhere almost every single day. My tribes are all from the foothills and up to the high mountains. And we spread from basically from Yosemite all the way down to Sequoia Park. One of the major things that we are in a part of is that the bad air, the pollution, most of the time sits right at the foothills and lower mountains, and about somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 foot level. So what happens and what we see and what we endure is that we have a lot of parasites within the trees, like mistletoe, for instance, is really bad. And then sudden death syndrome in some of the oaks and some of the other trees, drought, bark beetles. Everybody thrives on that climate of the bad pollution, and then especially invasive species. So one of the things that we constantly are up against is, trying to keep our native plants going and the natural plants out there. But the invasives, when they come in, they're really strong, they're really tough, they're hard to get rid of. We just continually go after them, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. It doesn't matter. We just keep plugging away and pulling them and removing them from our site. So once the natural vegetation, whether it's grass or the native plants, get reestablished, then they are actually able to hold out the invasive plants. Sometimes I think folks don't understand that down here in the valley, we use a lot of plants that are not from California, and a lot of the seed base in these plants will float for miles, 50 miles clear up into the mountains. And so we find velvet grass and a number of other plants growing, rapid in some areas where we haven't been able to reach them before. And so not only with the Forest Service, Park Service, the tribes, we all move around the forest, and when we see them, we'll stop and remove them ourselves, either by hand or later, if it's too big of a patch, well, then we'll come back to meetings and talk about, this, how we need to eradicate the invasive plant. So one of also the concepts then, when we look back at carbon sequestration, it's a long history, because since colonial times, when the Euro-American arrived here in our lands, they chose the biggest trees and cut down a lot of the pines and the sugar pines and trees that were 6-8 feet through, and never replaced them. And those trees with the stand today are the trees that are needed for the carbon sequestration. What we have out there on the forest is trees that have been planted since either the 1900s or the 50s, 25, 50-year-old plantations. They're all the same and they look like toothpicks. And so consequently, when a drought came in 2012, then they hit these trees because they were all bunched together and all same size. They hadn't been thinned, they hadn't been tended. It's kind of one of the managerial practices that we talk about to the agencies, that you can't just plant a garden and walk away from it. You have to tend it, you have to work it. When the Native American lived on the land before the Euro-American settled here in the 1800s, 1850s, the forest was kept at a 40% or less in canopy. So that means the cover, and that there was the distance between trees, also known as basal, was anywhere from 25 to 50 feet apart. A good average is 35, hoping for 45 feet apart. You're lucky to get trees that are even 5 feet apart today. So what that means is that they're all working against each other. There's nothing that's working together out there on the forest. And that makes a big difference in our climate. It makes a big difference in the amount of water that we have. I've looked at a couple of different studies over the years, 1991 and 2015. National Geographic says that in the world, we have the same amount of water as we've always had. Our problem is that our people have multiplied by 10 or more. And so we have to begin to understand how to work as people to minimize what our impacts are on our forest, on our upper watershed. I'm on a lot of different committees statewide and federally to ensure that our upper watershed is being taken care of. The upper watershed feeds the valley. 65 to 75% of our water down here in the valley comes from the upper watershed. Originally, all the water needs to go to the ocean, and not be dammed up on the San Joaquin River. Today, we got 15 different dams on the San Joaquin River. And that water needs to go to the ocean to cool the ocean down. So yes, we need agriculture. Yes, agriculture is good to feed the world. But the bottom line is it's not going to matter if we don't get control of our water and get control of the climate. So if the ocean is not being cooled down, then the ocean is getting warmer. The ocean is rising because as the ocean warms up, it melts the ice packs in north and in the South Pole. And consequently, our ocean is on a rise. And we've been studying that for quite a while. What happens then is we start to look at the unstability of our climate. And we look at the what we call the rivers that run through the atmospheric rivers, and they're bringing heavy storms. So either you're getting floods or you're getting drought, and there's no predictability to it. We have no control over what we're doing. All that comes back then to the air pollution of what we're doing, down here to create this bad air, and look at how we can make changes to that. I know I don't have much time. So one of the things as tribes, we're moving toward what we call cultural burning. Small burns that we go through, and we're clearing and cleaning both the underbrush and as well as the tree levels, and opening the land up, renewing the land, creating a fresh vegetation so that root system can hold water, and it also becomes a defensible space for wildfires. Now it's small in nature when you're working with cultural burning, but we've been doing this for 20, 30 years. And if it was done by a lot of folks all the time, you'll see a lot of ranchers are pretty much doing similar stuff. And that's the kind of way that we have to attack it as a people, as a community, and that everybody is involved taking care of their lands. And when you see that, it's a whole lot better in that area, in those areas. I just did a extreme heat conference just the other day, and a part of that extreme heat that we're looking at now with all these 100-degree days where we average 38, but now we're getting 60s and 70s, 100-degree temperatures. Well, not only are we here in the valley growing more houses and we're growing less crops, we're eating up the agricultural lands to put a sprawl out on the land, and we're creating more pavement, more concrete. Houses are being built with tile roofs. So we're creating more of a heat base. And then when you get up into the mountains and we have wildfires like we did the Creek Fire, that burned through 378,000 acres. Well, now what's left is rock, no trees. It's not sucking up any of the water, but at the same time, it's not sucking up any carbon sequestration either. So, that we're kind of in a conundrum at this very point in time. How much of my time do I have? I don't see anybody.
Just got about 2 more minutes.
Oh,
and then we can
I got
switch
a few
to
more
a
minutes.
question
All
or
right.
two from the
Cool. So one of the things that we are as a tribe, and my tribe is one of the lead tribes, we've been restoring meadows for the past 30 years. And we have over 10,000 meadows in the Sierra Nevada mountains, not just here on this forest. But 70% need maintenance or repair, 25% are non-existent, and only 5% of our 10,000 meadows that we have recorded are healthy. And so, that's the system that was originally put in by creator and by, by the land base that's here. And instead of putting in dams and tunnels and thinking that's how we're going to do to capture water, even the lakes and the wonderful hydroelectric power that we have here, where we're talking on Zoom and on the computer, we're losing 20% of our water base in the hydroelectric projects because they're so antiquated. And we're also losing another 20% in our lake coffers that the transvaporation gets away from us. We can't afford to lose 20%. We can't afford to lose 40% of their water here in the valley. Not for agriculture, not for urban, not for the ocean. So, we need to really look seriously at the things that we can change and that we can affect. Is that my 2 minutes?
Mhm. Yes, thank you so much for sharing with us that information, Chairman Goode. So we have about time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. If anybody has any questions or comments they want to bring up, feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand. So I see Catherine raised your hand. Go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chairman Goode, for all of that information. I was wondering what your experience has been like working with local agencies like the city and the county, and if you've had any encounters with agencies like the Air District.
With the Air District, we'll start with them because we came to the Air District down in 2017 to make some changes. One of those changes was to, when we start a prescribed fire up in the mountains, to allow it to burn through. Most of your prescribed fires will take 5 to 6 days to get through. But when you try to stop it, it takes 2 or 3 days to stop it, and then it's a mess. And so we haven't accomplished anything by putting it, putting a halt to it, even if it's a bad air day down here. So one of the things that was passed was that now these agencies can finish their job and get it done right. And when we talk about getting that done right, when the wildfire came to Shaver Lake in that creek fire, because Southern California Edison was burning and burning correctly, and they were allowed to finish their burns, that part that they've been burning north of Shaver Lake saved the lake, saved the town. And because they were able to go out there and get a handle on the wildfire. So that made it defensible. So that's one of the big rules that we've got there. I myself also brought in cultural burning, and we're going to be doing cultural burning throughout the state. Cultural burns are very small. You're not going to see our smoke down here in the valley. You're not going to smell our smoke down here in the valley, but we're going to get something accomplished when we do. Good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Goode. And we have a question in the chat. Curious what the natural landscape of the valley was before it got covered in agriculture, and maybe a little bit on how we can begin restoring it.
Great question. I just did a couple of these presentations, especially with the extreme heat, and we look at the valley before the Euro-American arrived, and the entire valley was inundated with water, sloughs, rivers, creeks, and even the native people traveled around in boats, Thule rafts, from one village to another. Then once we started putting in dams and we started putting in canals, what we started to do immediately was to block floods. Well, we don't want it flooding no more, but that flooding in that flood area is exactly what the farmer has been living off of these past 90 years. Those are the prime grounds, but we quit flooding. So now that soil and that ground that's been being farmed is getting weak. And so, until we decide that we need to start opening up a little bit more flooding again, and you can have controlled flooding, there's nothing wrong with that. So those are one of the things that we need to go back to, looking at how to take care of the land and put water back out on the land. And so, good question.
Thank you. And one last question / comment from Matt, and then we will pass it on to our next panelist.
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. Chairman Goode, I wanted to ask, it kind of sounds like you're providing traditional ecological conservation projects and fire ecology projects beyond tribal lands. Are you working on so-called public lands operated by state and federal agencies?
I work on the national park, National Forest Service, county, state, tribal lands, private lands. We'll go wherever with whomever we can. We're also some of the people that are creating new organizations have been trained by me, and so they're working with other tribes trying to reestablish ways that they can go out and help the rancher burn. We can go on and on about that, but there's a lot of stipulations, the state has been looking at to allow ranchers to burn, but the liability is so risky that that's hard for them to want to risk their property in the event that a fire gets away from them. And there's things that have been being put forth by the governor and others, and even in our fire plans, I've worked on those diligently. But it's still very difficult for an individual to say, well, I want to buy $2 million worth of liability, but if a fire escapes, it's going to be 12 million, and then how am I going to have to put my property up for the other 10 million? And that's just not worth what they want to do. Even the tribes are having the same problem, that, yeah, we can buy liability, but then we're responsible.
Yeah, I was wondering if they're paying you on a fee for service basis, or if this is like a lot of our work, doing the government job for them and training them for free.
You got it the second time.
Damn it.
We're the ones that are doing the job. We can't even hardly get grants. It's there's millions and billions of dollars being put out, but it all starts going through filters through other agencies, and you got to jump through their hoops to get the money. And they're not putting the money out whether it's legislature or the governor.
Yeah.
And they say, well, here's what we need to do, here's what needs to happen. Yes, but that money never gets down here to those of us that are doing the work.
That's what I was worried about. And what about like the legal, statutorily required tribal consultation, either from the feds or now with the state, maybe 52? Are they paying you to consult with them, or are they just asking you to provide them with free intellectual property?
Yeah, that's a good one. No, you don't get paid to be consulted with. And there's actually a bigger issue, because being consulted with just means that you come to me to tell me what you're going to be doing and ask for my input, and then you go back to your office, and that's the extent of our consultation.
Yeah.
So it's not really working together or looking for, even the federal right now, we just have a new policy that was passed down this summer from June or July, and it's called Indigenous Traditional Ecological Knowledge, ITEK. But again, you're talking about that knowledge that we may have. Not only do ranchers have the same knowledge, tribes have the same knowledge, tribal members do, but until you have the experience, and TEK actually comes from traditional cultural practice. And so if you're not doing the practice out there on the land, then all you do is have the knowledge. So I don't know if I made sense with that on you, but I do a lot of writing. I've written a lot of articles, and in the very beginning, my articles were all about my knowledge and what was passed down to me from generation to generation. Now, when I write, I'm talking about the experience that I've experienced and come to a better understanding of what that knowledge means.
No, that made perfect sense. Thanks for explaining. You guys just need a satellite and then you can hit them for a giant contract and they'll pay it without blinking.
Hey, that's a good
Yeah,
idea.
whether it turns on or not, right? Just
That's a good idea.
Thank you, Matt.
thanks.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Chairman Good. Well, there'll be more time for more questions for Chairman Good, but it is time to move on to our next panelist. Our next panelist is going to be Asha Sharma, the organizing co-director with Pesticide Action Network of North America. And with that, I'll pass it off to Asha.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Let me try to share my screen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Good. Okay.
President Tori. Sorry, folks. Just want to say hi to Tori. I haven't seen him in I don't know how long, decades, I think. A ver, ¿cuándo vienes to Huron? I'll treat you to tacos. All you can eat.
Yeah, don't divulge how long it's been.
I know, man. Like 2 years? Orale, brother. Good to see you, man.
Are you all seeing my presenter view or the actual slideshow?
We are seeing your presenter view.
Okay. All right, let's see if I can figure
Yeah.
out how to do this. Okay, how about now?
We're good to go. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Perfect. So today I'm going to be talking about reducing pesticide use to achieve climate justice and how alternative agricultural systems other than our current industrial chemical dependent agricultural system that we see today in the San Joaquin Valley, how alternative systems can serve as important climate solutions. So just to get started, I'll just give a quick overview of pesticides generally. So pesticides are chemicals that are applied primarily in agriculture to control pests. And pests can mean weeds, insect pests, rodents, you name it. It's an umbrella term. They're used in California at 4.5 times the national rate. That's per acre, per agricultural acre. The source of that is a Union of Concerned Scientists paper on farm worker health and climate change. And pesticides carry many health risks. It's estimated that as little as 0.1% of pesticides that are applied actually reach their intended target. The rest are ending up in soil, in our air, and in our water. And these cause really extreme health effects since they are really designed to harm life. So these effects can include cancer, it can include neurological diseases like Parkinson's, and it especially can affect children who are much more vulnerable to the effects of pesticides, given they're in a critical stage of development. So we have also seen things like autism in children linked to pesticide use. And importantly, these pesticide health impacts are falling on people of color in California, making addressing pesticides a critical environmental justice pursuit. So this is a really, I think, important statistic to point out from the California EPA, which says that 60% of zip codes with the highest proportion of residents of color host more than 95% of agricultural pesticide use in the state. So again, just really highlighting that point, and you can see in this map of pesticide use in California that a lot of pesticide use is really heavily concentrated in the Central Valley. And when we talk about specifically who this is affecting, it's primarily affecting Latinx residents. In California, that especially means farm workers, more than 90% of which are from Mexico. farm workers and their families experience extremely high rates of exposure to pesticides because of weak enforcement of pesticide protections, because of their proximity to pesticide applications through their place of work or where they live, and also oftentimes due to inadequate housing that doesn't protect them adequately from pesticides in their environment. So this is a really critical climate injustice as well, given that the people most impacted by pesticide impacts are also those that are on the front lines of climate change impacts, like extreme heat and wildfire smoke, which also are really affecting farm workers in California. And then in this slide, I wanted to explain what we call the vicious cycle of pesticides and climate change. We're writing a whole report actually on this concept, which we'll be releasing in the winter. So feel free to contact me if you're interested in learning more about this. But firstly, climate change is unfortunately expected to increase pesticide use in multiple ways. So first of all, climate change decreases the ability for agricultural crops to be resilient or to withstand external forces such as climate change impacts or pest pressure. For instance, we see the drought affecting agriculture throughout California. This weakens plants' natural defenses to pests. And pests can actually sense this. They can sense things like insect pests specifically. They can sense things like leaf yellowing, which is a sign of stress in crops. And then that signals to the insect pests to go and predate that crop. At the same time, we're anticipating increases in pest pressure in agriculture. Pests will be able to move to new regions where they couldn't exist before because of climate change. They're also going to be able to survive the winter. Insect pests, for instance, their numbers really typically die down in the winter. But because of warmer temperatures, we're going to see more buildups of pests. And at the same time, pesticides are expected to become less effective because of climate change. This is going to happen for a range of reasons. One reason is that increases in soil temperature that are expected in climate change actually make pesticides less effective because it decreases the amount of time that pesticides control weeds, because it speeds up degradation of pesticides, which means that they are not as effective for as long after they're applied, which will lead farmers more than likely to apply pesticides at higher rates and at increased frequency. So climate change ultimately is expected to increase pesticide use, which is a big problem because pesticides also release greenhouse gas emissions, which lead to climate change. So importantly, synthetic chemicals, of which pesticides fall into, 99% of synthetic pesticides are derived from fossil fuels. A lot of the major oil and gas companies that you're familiar with, like Chevron and Shell, they manufacture pesticide ingredients. So inherently, pesticides are linked to greenhouse gas emissions because they are derived from fossil fuels. But greenhouse gas emissions are also released across the life cycle of pesticides. A lot of energy is required to produce pesticides. There's greenhouse gas emissions associated with the transportation of pesticides. And then greenhouse gas emissions can be released when pesticides are actually applied to agricultural fields. For instance, fumigant pesticides, which are a class of pesticides applied to soil, and they're the most used class of pesticides in California. They've been linked to huge spikes in nitrous oxide emissions, which is a really potent greenhouse gas, and have been known to cause these huge spikes in emissions that lead to climate change. So ultimately, we're seeing this vicious cycle that's created due to climate change and due to pesticide use and how they affect each other. Okay. And next, I wanted to talk to you about agroecology as a climate solution. So first, I'll just define what agroecology is. So diversified agroecological farming works with nature rather than against it. It minimizes synthetic chemical inputs. In agroecology, farming centers the decision-making power and knowledge of historically underrepresented farmers, of farm workers, and indigenous people and local communities. So I'll get into some examples of farms that are implementing agroecology so you get a sense of what this actually means in practice. So the first farm I'll talk about is Crece Urban Farms on the right, which is a farm based in Santa Ana, California, where they haven't used pesticides in 4 years now. And they attribute this to their high crop diversity, and through building soil health and by extension, healthier, more resilient crops through applying mulch and compost. Rotating to crops or planting a diversity of crops is really important because it prevents buildups of the same pest and disease because you're rotating or growing different crops that don't have the same pest or disease vulnerabilities. This other farm, Kandarian Organic Farm, is a 138-acre farm in Los Osos Valley, where they grow more than 1,000 crops. So again, they're really trying to mimic the diversity that we see in nature that mitigates climate change while also making farms much more resilient. And Larry Kandarian, the farm owner, said this quote to me: "Learn to live with the weeds." And that's been his key to transitioning to organic agriculture. And supporting this really diverse a range of crops that he has on his field that he says also helps attract good bugs that predate on insect pests on the farm. And I'll go to the next slide. So ultimately, agroecology. Oh, sorry. Yes. Yeah.
1 minute warning.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. So ultimately, agroecology and diversified organic agriculture reduce chemical inputs and therefore mitigate climate change. They help shift systems and are really rooted in social justice rather than shift single farming practices. They increase farm resilience to climate change. And importantly, they center local, or agroecology centers local and indigenous knowledge and social justice. And so just this last slide is some ways to get involved. So if you're interested in learning more, you can join Californians for Pesticide Reform, which is where a lot of the organizing and around pesticides in California takes place. You can also help amplify our upcoming report on pesticides and climate change. You can also support pesticide use reduction, agroecology, and indigenous land management and land back as climate change solutions. And you can support organizing efforts led by the communities most impacted by negative health effects from industrial agriculture, like farm workers. So thank you so much, and I'll take a few questions.
Great, thank you. We have time for one quick question, and I think you might have answered John's question about getting more information on the pesticide cycle report. So is emailing you the best way to access that report?
Yes, that would be great. And I'll put my email in the chat for everyone. There you go.
Great. Does anybody have one question for Asha? If not, we can move on to Tori, and you all can dwell on that since we will have a little bit more time for questions towards the end. Great. Go ahead, Matt.
I'm always going to take the opportunity. I'll be quick. You know, there's a lot of green revolution, industrial agriculture all around the world. Is there anything that's particularly not good about California agriculture besides the grotesque water allocations and the exploitive labor? Is there, like, in the world of pesticides or soil management, is there something that we're particularly egregious at here?
I think there's a lot of things. Water use, of course, is a really big one. We don't have a lot of water right now in California, but we're growing a lot of crops that require huge amounts of water, like almond orchards, really any orchards. And you kind of see these huge scale orchards that are really monocropped, growing the same thing. There's no crop diversity. So you really don't have the same type of ability for the soil to hold on to water when it does rain, which is a huge problem. And then also California does use huge amounts of toxic chemicals, whether that's synthetic fertilizers or synthetic pesticides. We grow a lot of high value crops in California, like fruits and vegetables. So farmers are really afraid that if they don't apply a lot of pesticides or fertilizer, that they'll lose yield. They won't produce as much. And they're worried that they would have big profit losses because of kind of the significant inputs that they have to put into their farming systems because they're growing such high value crops. So there's a lot more to lose for them than there are for other farmers that might be growing lower value commodity crops like soy and corn in other states. So that's one of the reasons that is in the literature about why we have this really particularly toxic chemical dependent system in California, but there's a lot that could be improved. I'm sure Tori will also touch on.
Great, thank you, Asha. And again, we will have some more time to ask all of the panelists question after our third panelist, Tori Estrada, Executive Director and Policy Director with Carbon Cycle Institute. So with that, I'll take it away, Tori.
Thanks, Cynthia. If you wouldn't mind putting slides up. Just want to say thanks for CVAC and for inviting me into your community, and also want to give a shout out to the EJAC, who I really appreciate taking on this issue of natural working lands. I think it's actually a really important, but sometimes kind of swept under the rug a little bit. So let me see if you guys can get up slides. Thanks. So you can advance to the next slide. So with only 10 minutes today, I was sort of struggling from what to sort of provide to this group to, I think, be helpful, assuming you're going to be engaged in some of these discussions. And what I thought might be helpful is just a bit of framing, so to really understand what we're talking about in terms of natural working lands. So we've talked a little bit today about what those encompass. So Chairman Goode talked about forest, we've talked about agriculture. We actually mentioned that we should lift up rivers in our aquatic system as part of the natural system, oceans. I don't want to forget the sort of urban areas that typically get underlooked, the urban ecology that, you know, is trying to thrive in our developed areas in California, but in some ways hold a lot of I think a lot of promise in terms of restoring landscapes, because there are actually people there to manage those landscapes that care about those landscapes. So I just want to be clear also to define a little bit about how natural working lands fits into climate change. And I put this slide up, or this picture up, because most of our conversation around climate change is focused on the atmosphere. We're pumping, we're digging up fossil fuel and gases, burning them in our machines and putting that in the atmosphere. And that's typically where climate change ends. But it's really important to note that the oceans actually are the biggest reservoir of carbon on the planet, have been for millennium. And frankly, are saving our bacon right now. Most of the excess CO2 that's being pulled out of the atmosphere is actually being pulled in the oceans, which is causing problems. But that is a piece of our natural working land system that typically doesn't get talked about, but a really important piece of it. Second behind that is actually our soil, or terrestrial, what we call terrestrial systems. And over time, those systems have been the predominant workhorse for moving carbon into the atmosphere. And so if we think about it, it's not sort of carbon moves into soils and stays there. It's actually a healthy system is always respiring carbon and nitrous oxide. If you can think about soil as being this permeable layer, right? It's like almost like your skin. It's not like goes in and stays. It actually cycles through because it's a biology. It's also respirating as well. But in many of our conversations, we don't talk about the role of soils at all in climate change. So it's just something to really think about too, because we typically talk about carbon as pollution from fossil fuels. And I'm going to talk a little bit about carbon in its natural form, even CO2 is actually an asset. It actually forms our own bodies. It forms the plants that we rely upon. So I say that because I think the solution set for climate change is not limited to just carbon pollution. It's about what carbon the atmosphere actually has done over time, that I wanted to kind of lift up a bit because it may open your minds a little bit about sort of what the solutions might look like. Next slide. So it's also important to realize this figure moves around, but about 30% of the legacy carbon that's in the atmosphere driving climate change is actually from, as Chairman Goode and others have talked about, it's actually from the alteration of our what we call terrestrial ecosystems, that those soils, those plants, that could be forest, wetlands, being destroyed over since the industrial age primarily. So we've actually taken that carbon in plants and actually threw it in the atmosphere. And what I think it's also important to know is that when we clear these forests and drain these wetlands, there are people who actually did that. There was labor behind that. It didn't just happen magically. But also cultures and people and economies were destroyed in that as well. And I say that because I think it's important to realize that that destruction's happened over the last 100 years. We still, most of us have a lineage that's connected to that and communities that actually come from those systems. In a typical climate conversation, that entire set of experiences and cultures and knowledge is mostly not talked about. All we talk about is forward-looking economy and what can we do in the context of our current day. But I think if we look back, we can actually sort of build upon a foundation of knowledge and culture that's there. I'll talk about a little bit later. Next slide. So with that sort of volatilizing of carbon out of our terrestrial system, we also have degraded our soil significantly. And a large part of that has been we lost the carbon that's in our soil and the nutrients. And this is something that's not really talked about. This is actually an old figure from 2015. There's been so much soil depletion, and how Asha talks about the fertilizers and all the inputs. It's because we degraded the productivity that nature provided for us. So in the Central Valley, this huge conglomerations of wetlands and rivers actually created the soil biology and the soil carbon that then got mined to do farming. And we've done that across the world, right? But now we got into severe soil degradation levels to where without significant inputs, they're going to be limited. We have a limited number of harvests left in the world. So this is actually, I feel like it's put us in this juncture in the road. Do we continue to mechanize our agriculture and our food systems, or do we rebuild them? I mean, I think that's, at least from my framing, I think part of what we need to really grapple with in a place like California, where the average level of carbon in our soil, which is a measure of productivity, is at below 1%. Historic levels before agriculture were probably closer to 8 to 10%. And if we're talking about wetlands and forest systems, we're talking close to 20% of the volume of soil being carbon. So that's just one metric or one way to think about it, but it's an important thing to think about in terms of the larger challenge we have here around climate change, is that we actually have these cascading sets of crises that are connected to that. And if we don't connect those together, I think we're actually not going to be able to solve the problem. So a state climate policy absent a soil policy doesn't really going to get us there. I don't think. I think it's not going to get us very far. Next slide. And I just want to remind folks, because this is I think a really empowering way to think about it. I know this is science, and I'm not meaning to kind of, overly do science here, but the fundamental mechanism behind natural working lands is that plants with soils actually take up carbon dioxide using sun to convert that into carbohydrates, which is the body of all plants, right? And part of that energy goes into root systems and goes into the soil system that basically drives the whole ecology. But it starts with this fundamental idea, and this is that's why I hate that oil and gas is now taking carbon sequestration, taking away the term, because carbon sequestration is probably the longest R&D project on the planet. It was the foundation for all life on the planet, which is this simple idea that plants could take up CO2, respire oxygen, which has created us, right? And then created all this productivity that now we're mining, right? But that mechanism of photosynthesis is still there. The carbon sequestration, which is the depositing of that carbon in the soil system and driving productivity, is still there too. So I would urge us to reclaim carbon sequestration as not only this natural process, but this is always managed with humankind, right? Going back to agroecology and indigenous knowledge, it's like it's connected to our communities and the way they were built, right? These fundamental science, this fundamental planetary process is actually connected to how we grew our societies as well. So just want us to remind us to capture that. And this is like, you know, 4th grade science, which our state agencies tend to forget. Next slide.
Yeah, and 2-minute warning, Tori.
Okay, wow, I gotta really move now. Okay, next slide. So the reason why I'm saying this is because if we think about sort of life on the planet, it all starts with photosynthesis, plants, and soils. Like that's the foundation of all our ecology. If we talk about agroecology, that's the fundamental principle that we need to really be thinking about. What's the health of the soils, the organic matter that feeds the rest of the soil biology? And we're at the top of this, right? But this is what drives biodiversity. This is what drives productivity in the agricultural system. This is how we, you know, bring forests back. But without this fundamental sort of recapturing of this fundamental piece of it, I think this is going to be really challenging. So climate change in the natural working lands context is not just about greenhouse gas reduction. In some ways, what it should be about is how do we recarbonize our natural systems that have lost carbon, that have lost productivity. And I could spend a whole webinar talking about how we can do that, but the point is there are many ways to do that. But I think the fundamental challenge we have is that we don't actually have an economy that's really focused on this, right? Farmers are not doing this because that's not primarily what they're being paid for. They're paid for units of production as opposed to being paid for creating the biodiversity, the soil health and stuff that we wanted to do. So we're essentially, I think at the state of California, we're at the natural working lands plan that CVAC has talked about is really this, I think this critical historical moment where we actually need to define a path of how we want to move forward. And unless we really center the ecology, I think it's going to be really hard to sort of turn back. Next slide.
All right. Tori, if you could close and we can get started on discussion.
Yeah. So I guess the one thing I'll say, 2 things I'll say really quick is sort of carbon sequestration in the land base, as I just talked about it, has actually been a core principle for the state's climate change since 2014, yet it hasn't really been talked about because there hasn't been a constituency to lift it up, I think, significantly. The other piece I'd really have you guys think about is sort of like we all have this connection to our history, our culture. We're all 2 or 3 generations from actually have worked land. And that's not really talked about in the i.e.regenerative natural working lands plan. I think we need to reclaim that history, that knowledge. We need to be thinking about supporting, as Asha said, ecological systems and building an economy with the inputs needed, land access funding to be able to do that. Because to do this work we're talking about, it won't be done by industrial ag. What it's going to need is a lot more people on the land, as Chairman Goode said, tending the garden. So who's going to tend the garden towards what end, and what's the economy and the politics that actually can really drive it? And that's what I think is really at stake with the natural working lands plan that's coming up. So with that, I'll leave you with that. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, panelist Asha, Tori, Chairman Goode. With that, I want to allocate the next about 15-ish minutes for any comments or questions that you all might have for any of the panelists. So I think the first person we have up already is Olivia. Olivia, if you have a question for any of our panelists.
Yeah, thank you. This was really, really interesting. Sorry, Olivia Seidman, Chief of Pronouns with Leadership Council. And I kind of have 2 questions. The first is I just want to make sure I understood correctly. So like with agroecology, farming that's done with agroecology principles is like a better carbon sink than say like monoculture because the soils are healthier and so they're able to sequester more carbon. Is that correct? Or are there other mechanisms there that make more diverse, biodiverse farming practices better, better carbon sinks? And then I have another question just about like sequestration in general, you know, like especially with engineered, like the state is relying on engineered carbon strategies to meet climate goals, but which, as you know, folks know is really harmful to communities. And so I'm wondering like if there are estimates about like the scale of natural and working lands we would need in tandem with other emissions reduction strategies to meet our climate goals without engineered carbon sequestration or other engineered carbon removal strategies. Sorry, that was kind of a lot. Let me know if any of that was unclear.
Thanks, Olivia. Do any of the panelists? Okay, Asha, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna maybe try to tackle her first question about agroecology. So yes, I think you're right that building up healthy soils is an important part of the benefits that agroecology can have for climate mitigation. Agroecology can also include other beneficial practices. I think a big one is also agroforestry. So planting native trees on farms can also hold a lot of benefits for sequestering carbon. Also, just the fact that agroecology reduces the amount of toxic chemicals. So that includes nitrogen fertilizers and also pesticides, which are both sources of greenhouse gas emissions. That also really helps, I think, with climate change. And then also oftentimes with agroecology or diversified organic agriculture, instead of, for instance, nitrogen fertilizers, you're adding forms of organic amendments to the soil to support your soil fertility and soil health. So you're adding carbon back into the soil. So those are just a couple ways or pathways that agroecology, I think, contributes to climate change mitigation, but there's a lot of different examples and also happy to chat more about that.
Maybe I'll try to take the second part of that question. There have been estimates, I think, of the sort of natural working lands, both from a greenhouse gas reduction. So as Asha talked about, reducing fertilizers, pesticides, and other on-farm or sectoral greenhouse gases plus carbon sequestration. There have definitely been estimates of what that would take. I think the challenge has been to really oversimplify this is sort of an economy that there's no economy to support the investment currently, if that makes sense to you. So to do the agroecology we're talking about requires, at least for those that are not doing these practices, to make a fairly big shift in a food system that doesn't support that. I mean, that's overly simplistic, but I think that's a really main driver. And that's why I think you see ARB doubling down on carbon sequestration, because somebody's trying to grow a market around that. So, and industrial ag hasn't really stepped up to the space in a big way. I think in California, we're looking at small and medium-sized producers, some of them that are organic and diversified, but many that are making transition who really don't have the wherewithal to make that transition. It's a huge upfront. It's like akin to what we're doing in the urban sector around solar, right? It's like, it's a major investment for most farmers who don't make a lot of money. We're asking them to make that transition with almost zero support system. I mean, it's really stacked against land managers to do the right thing. Not that it's an excuse, but we need a system that will support that transition.
Great, thanks, Asha and Tori. We have a question in the.
Oh, Cynthia, I
ahead.
was just quickly going to add from the perspective of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. First of all, really appreciate Asha and Tori's answers and want to underscore that this is the first time the Air Resources Board is attempting to do this type of modeling, and they're not very well equipped to do it. So we're definitely very concerned that they're underestimating the potential for natural sequestration and overestimating the reliance on engineered carbon capture. So definitely an issue that we need to continue to push on.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. And then we have a question in the chat for all panelists. What pesticide bills are you all working on for next legislative session, if any?
I can also take a stab at that. Thanks, John. We are also very disappointed that the neonics bill didn't get signed by Newsom. We're actually in the middle of deciding what our coalition priorities are with the Coalition Californians for Pesticide Reform for the next legislative session. So if you're interested in learning more, or being a part of that process, I'm happy to facilitate that. I think right now the challenge is that they're predicting that there's going to be a decrease in state revenue this upcoming year. And then Newsom is also, I think, trying to appear more moderate for a potential presidential run. So it's looking like there's going to be less opportunity to, I think, pass some of the great bills that we've seen the past couple of years because of these, I think, revenue limitations. So I think we're also trying to think of ways to work with state agencies to adopt regulations where we wouldn't have to work through the legislative process and instead kind of use funding or existing programs and direct them towards efforts that would reduce pesticide use in California and support agroecology and some of the other systems that we want to see. But hopefully we'll have some updates soon on what we're moving forward, and yeah, happy to stay in touch about that or plug you into the process.
This is Ron. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Chairman Goode.
Okay. We don't necessarily work on bills anymore. Did that back in the 80s. Now we just flat out tell every agency we work with and anybody that wants to use pesticides that we oppose it. And we make it very adamant, and we go out. You can't stop the agencies. So basically what we do is wait until the pesticide hurts somebody. It's a sad thing to say, but a lot of our resources have to be along roads and stuff where we have enough access because our roads and our trails have all been blocked. So consequently, our elders and others try to get to someplace that's easy for them to gather their resources. And that's the first thing that counties and forests and parks, they all spray along the roads. So when they do, the pesticides they claim don't last more than a month. It's still there months later. And then so when our people, either even if they're gathering mushrooms or they're gathering red buds or whatever they're doing, it still affects them. And when it does, well, then that's when we throw it back at them, because now it's serious. Now it's time to understand what you just did, so it's a hard way to go, but we've been fighting this fight since the 70s and 80s. And so now it's just, take it to them.
Thanks. Tori, did you want to take a stab at this question too, or does anybody else have any other questions for the panelists?
I would like to reiterate a little bit on the soils. Didn't have time to talk about that, but it's along with our cultural burning and what we're trying to, the way that we conduct our burns. We never leave ash on the surface. We take that ash and we mix it until we create a nutrient. And when we're done, you're not going to see where we burned. You're not going to see the ash, and you're going to get an immediate return. But if and where ash is left, there will not be a return. And we're studying some of that as well. I've been out with the forest in the park where they've talked about some place that they burned 50 years ago, 70 years ago. and the ash is still there, still on the ground. And so one of the things that we're also looking at then, as we mimic the midden that was that the ancestors put on the ground from their centuries of living there in these sites, that too then is a, you know, one of the better sequesters of carbon that we can have in that soil, and those are really important. So there's a lot of the art from archaeology and including the agencies are at least listening to some of that studies and things like that. So, you know, the things that Asha and Tori were talking about here is just fantastic. I think I'm glad to be on this call with them, but we need their voices out. You know, they need to be heard more.
Thank you, Chairman Good. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments for the panelists? And if not, maybe we could get some closing thoughts or statements from Asha and Tori as well. And if you have anything else to add, Chairman Good? Great, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat and nobody's raising their hand. Just seeing a lot of thank yous for the panelists. So Asha, Tori, do you guys want to close off, and then Chairman Good, if you want to add anything else?
Let Asha go.
Yeah, I'll just say it was a privilege to be invited to speak and to speak with Chairman Good and Tori. I learned a lot from you all as well, and happy to be a resource for anyone interested in learning more about pesticides, agroecology, and climate change. Thank you.
Yeah, I know everybody wants to go. It's late. Thank you for having me. And if anybody's interested in diving into what's happening around agriculture in terms of innovative approaches and strategies, I'm happy to host a session. We do it all the time with our partners. So, but thanks again.
Great, thanks. And I know Chairman Good made a really good point about having folks share their voices and make their voices heard. So I wanted to close off by sharing this opportunity with the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee that's going to be meeting in person here in Fresno on Monday, the 24th at the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District location office. There's going to be an in-person option available. There's a Zoom option available, and we can drop the Zoom link in the chat as well. But before we all head off and close off, wanted to have an exit poll for you all, asking, you know, how do we feel our knowledge has increased after hearing from all the panelists tonight? So I'll go ahead and launch that poll and give you all some time to note the information for the upcoming meeting. I'm not sure if any EJAG members want to make any closing remarks in regards to the upcoming meeting. Yeah, Tom, go ahead. I mean, Matt, sorry.
Yeah, I'll just chime in that this has been such a educational experience participating in this EJAC, and the number of people that are, you know, skilled technical practitioners who have come out of the woodwork to offer their time and expertise pro bono to try to save this state from itself. It's been, you know, even though the plan isn't what I want it to be, I like what I've learned about the team of people in California that are down to show up and fight for what's right. And so hoping to keep this energy going. And continue to learn from folks that know more than I do, and use my big mouth to elevate their perspective. So I'm really grateful to you all for everything you helped us with and our recommendations. And hopefully we can continue to keep doing this work. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. I'll give you all another minute or two to fill out the poll question. It looks like we're at 68% participation. So if a few more folks can answer the poll.
Everybody answer the poll. I already did. I'm pretty quick. I'm a good student sometimes. I just like to invite everybody. You know, we have a regenerative organic ag type of course going on. We're engaging folks from here on and other parts of the west side. So we got a community garden that we've set up. We put up a greenhouse with USDA funding and working with UC Davis to compare the effectiveness of liquid fertilizer made out of food waste through an anaerobic process and competing it to industrial fertilizer. So I'm rooting for the liquid fertilizer from food waste. So maybe it'll create jobs in Huron, you know. So everybody's welcome. Chairman, I'm also a mayor of my city. Welcome to my home here in Huron. I'd like to feed you some good tacos and, you know, give you a tour. Tori, the same. Asha, también. And I'd like to invite you all to give a plática, a little talk to my folks out here because it is something totally new from them, for them. I have a master gardener. He's call him a green sorcerer, but it's, you know, it's this is good energy, great knowledge and wisdom that I want the folks that are totally unfamiliar with all of this, environmental climate justice as well, which we're providing them better understanding of, you know, so that they could get more active, you know. So, and pa allá vamos. Everybody welcome to the heart of the valley, Huron, California.
Thanks for that plug, Ray. And I dropped in the chat, Trish with CARB has dropped, the California Resources Board dropped some of the details for the meeting on the 24th. I dropped the Zoom link for those folks who aren't located in Fresno, but still might want to join. But I'll go ahead and share these results where we feel, for the most part, we feel ready to take action, but we still need some more information. So I know Asha dropped her email into the chat, Chairman Goode and Tori, as you feel comfortable, feel free to drop some of your information in the chat or any websites that folks could learn some more information to feel ready to be able to take some action. And we'll follow up with this recording. We'll post it on the CVAC YouTube and share it out to those that participated and within our network. So you can have this to look back on. But with that, thank you so much for taking the time to share your evening with us and learn a little bit more about how we can restore some of our lands to their prime and what they used to be before a lot of colonialism, settler colonialism, and a lot of these injustices have happened. So thank you all for a great evening.
Thank
All right,
you,
thank you.
everyone.
Thanks, Cynthia. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
All right, good